is messy, right? The human condition is an imperfect one. And one of my favorite quotes is that the goal of practice is simply to be a compassionate mess. In other words, that should be the aim of our life, to be a compassionate mess. So there's real two ways we can show ourselves compassion. There's tender self-compassion and there's fierce self-compassion. So tender self-compassion is the ability for us just to be with ourselves as we are in all our messiness, in all our brokenness, in all our imperfection, and also to open to the pain of life. And when we do that with compassion, it makes a huge difference in our ability to cope. So yes, we can't always get it right, and life's certainly not going to always go right for us. But when we can hold our pain and our struggles and our difficulty with compassion, then it gives us the emotional resources we need to really survive and get through. But it's not just tender self-compassion we need to get through the mess of life. We also need fierce self-compassion. In other words, we don't want to just be complacent about this mess called life. We also want to do what we can to change things for the better, not only inside ourselves, but also outside of us. So a part of fierce self-compassion is, fighting for justice, for instance, drawing boundaries, motivating change. This is also a really important part of compassion as we wade through the mess of life. And the main theme of the book is that we need to balance this fierce and tender approach to ourselves and our lives in order to be ultimately strong and resilient and effective. So my research shows that the vast majority of people are significantly kinder and more compassionate to others than they are to themselves. For women, it's 86%, and for men, it's 67%. It's especially hard for a woman because women are really socialized to be kind and giving to others and not necessarily themselves. And so, there's good news and bad news in that. The bad news is most of us aren't in the habit of being compassionate to ourselves. So it is a little bit difficult. It comes quite naturally to us when we're compassionate to our friends, when our friends need our support. But many of us haven't even thought about the fact that we can show ourselves the same kindness, care, and concern as we show those we care about. But the good news is, it's actually not that difficult to be self-compassionate. Yeah, it may feel a little bit weird. It may feel a little awkward. Maybe it feels a little phony at first, but we already know how to do it. We already have the template and the well-developed skills to know how to be warm and supportive and encouraging, how to use constructive criticism. So all we really need to do is give ourselves permission to make a U-turn and learn to treat ourselves the same way. So again, it's not hard. It's more about just some of the blocks that stand in the way. Like, for instance, we think that if we're kind to ourselves, we're going to be lazy and self-indulgent and lose our motivation or become weak. And again, the research shows it's the exact opposite. The kinder we are to ourselves, the stronger, the more motivated we'll be, the more we're able to give to others. So it's really just a mind shift that we need to make. I'm pretty familiar with the research literature on self-compassion. There are over 3,500 studies now on self-compassion. I knew all the benefits that self-compassion gave us. But with this book, part of what I wanted to do is talk about how self-compassion can be used in realms that maybe we haven't thought about so much. And one of the most important realms that this book is really predicated on is the ability of self-compassion to help women in particular reclaim their fierce side. Unfortunately, gender role socialization makes it hard for women to be as fierce as maybe we need to be in certain situations, to stand up for ourselves or to draw boundaries. People don't really like fierce women. They especially don't like angry women, which disempowers us because anger, when it's harnessed for good, when it's harnessed for alleviating suffering, is an important aspect of self-compassion. And so I started talking to women about the role that fierce self-compassion played in their lives, or just the role of fierceness that it played in their lives. And I was really surprised by how many women said that they absolutely needed really permission to develop their fierce side. Really just the understanding that fierceness, that even angers, drawing boundaries, meeting our own needs as opposed to continually giving them up for others, that when we frame that as an aspect of compassion, just a huge difference it made for women in our ability to, again, reclaim this fierce side of ourselves. And I was just really, really touched by how much women shared in terms of the ability that owning their fierceness had to really change their lives. I quote some research by a professor from Hastings University called Joan Williams, who talks about the need for women to practice what she calls gender judo. The judo is a martial art where you basically have to use your opponent's momentum in order to defend yourself, in order to make sure that you don't get knocked over. And she argues that women have to do this in terms of balancing how we express our the different sides of our nature at work. So women aren't allowed to be fierce. Gender role socialization shows that women are supposed to be tender and nurturing and not fierce. The research on women's success at work is really quite disheartening. Although you have to be competent and kind of fierce and stand up for yourself and your ideas in the workplace, people don't like women who are too competent or who stand up for their ideas because they assume that a competent woman isn't nurturing, and we like nurturing women. And unfortunately, one of the negative consequences of that is women aren't promoted as much or paid as much because of these perceptions that a competent woman, which she needs to be to get to succeed, is not likable. And so we tend to not promote or pay not likable people as much in general. So what Joan Williams argues is that one way women can overcome this is by practicing this gender judo. In other words, balancing our fierce and tender side. So when you promote yourself and maybe say, yes, I had this great accomplishment, these are my successes, which is needed to get maybe a salary raise. If you combine it with something like very personal about maybe praising someone else at work and, this other person did such a great job as well. If we're just too tender at work without enough fierceness, people won't think we're good at what we do. But if we're too good at what we do without being tender, people won't like us. And so, yes, it's practical, it makes sense, but in a way, it's just the reason it's kind of heartbreaking is, the fact that we have to do this. I mean, men don't have to worry about balancing their fierce and tender side at work. They can be strong, they can be angry, people like them for it, they think they're competent. They don't have to use part of their working memory space to always be thinking, how are people judging me? Was that too assertive? And women do. It's sad, but it's true. But that's also where, for women, that's why tender self-compassion is good, because we need to kind of honor the pain of it. We need to honor the pain that we can't really be our full, true selves at work. We have to constantly manage these gender role expectations. One of my hopes for this book is that as more and more women really learn to own both their fierce and their tender side and are able to express it more authentically. And maybe eventually, in our granddaughter's generation, they won't have to worry so much about consciously battling gender role stereotypes. The book is written for women primarily to help women, again, honor their fierceness and bring it into balance with their tenderness, even though that goes contrary to gender role socialization. And so it's especially helpful for women, but the idea of balancing fierceness and tenderness is useful for all people, regardless of your gender identity. And it's especially useful in work contexts. So the ability to balance, sometimes, I call it fierceness and tenderness, but you can also call it agency and communion. In other words, the kind of go-getter mindset, conquer things mindset with the accepting, friendly, more emotionally sensitive mindset. We know from the research that that's good for all people. So for instance, leaders who can combine both, who can actually show emotional sensitivity, emotional intelligence in the workplace, in addition to being very strong and competent, that actually they're considered more effective leaders. People like leaders like this. You can balance the fierceness and tenderness more. I mean, you can really be honest about, for instance, dealing productively with your failure. Instead of just beating yourself up and shaming yourself for your failure, if you can be vulnerable and open to that failure, that's actually going to allow you to learn and grow from your failure. The balance of fierceness and tenderness is good for everyone in the workplace. For instance, research shows that people who can, again, be their whole selves in the workplace, treat themselves with this kindness and support, they're less stressed on the job. They're less likely to suffer burnout. There's lower levels of turnover, for instance. People are more productive. These two sides of our nature are really important for all people, and any context, whether it's due to just the culture of work and business or gender role socialization in particular. Any context that makes us only half human, that doesn't allow us to draw on every side of us, including, the strength that comes from emotional tenderness and vulnerability and kind of kindness, and also the strength that comes from this fierce, competent, powerful, I like to call it mama bear energy. One of the reasons I think this book would be useful for anyone is because I have a lot of practices in it. And these practices are relevant for anyone, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a leader, whether you're an employee. It's really about being the most complete and effective human being we can be. So self-compassion isn't just a good idea, it's actually something we can practice. Because at the end of the day, the only way you'll really know if this is good for you is if you try it out for yourself and see the impact it has on your life.